Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew bring you truthful, unbiased information about real agricultural concerns. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
A single storm can destroy a year's worth of work. How do farmers deal with something as chaotic as the weather? That's our topic today on Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
Servitech has been helping producers across the Midwest make the planet more productive since 1975. We are proud sponsors of Real Ag, helping tell the story of how your food makes it to your plate.
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
What are some of the ways that weather affects agriculture?
When it comes to the weather forecast, the general forecast is going to be the same for both a city dweller and for an agricultural region. The information that the producer focuses on may be different from a city to the farm.
The weather is just a huge part of agriculture. Everybody's talking about it, and it could be as simple as comparing rainfall amounts, after a rainstorm event. How much rain did you get? And it can vary so much in the course of just a mile or two.
Well, it becomes very important in agriculture, especially as we talk about more modern operations and how people are integrating technology in their operations. So it can be everything from how you plan your irrigation schedule and how you adapt to the changing rainfall patterns, to what kind of shelter and climate control you provide for your animals that you might be having in a confined operation or even in the fields. They're constantly looking at weather parameters and trying to figure out how to manage their operation. And again, it runs the entire gamut in agriculture from are the winds going to be calm enough so that I can spray my pesticide today, to what's the rainfall outlook and do I need to change which variety I'm planting versus timing, or how much fertilizer I put on, and any number of questions that are impacted by the weather.
On the farm, you live, eat, and breathe the weather. I mean, it dictates almost everything you do, that and the markets, of course, but day-to-day operations, when you wake up in the morning and look out and it's raining, you get a shop day versus a field day, and so it really does affect the day-to-day operations. And then, of course, the long-term planning. If you're in a long-term drought, you might go with a more drought-resistant seed, or, it really does affect the day-to-day planning. There's still nothing you can do about it, and that's a frustrating thing for farmers. But by being able to plan ahead a little bit and say, well, I need to do some burning or spraying, and it looks like Thursday would be the day to do that, so I'm going to get something out of the way before that, or plan on something else over the weekend, then, it really does affect not only putting in the crop, but maintaining the ground. It affects the cattlemen, of course, and then it affects getting the crop out of the field. So it pretty much affects every facet of agriculture.
Some of the factors that producers are regularly monitoring for their operation include wind direction and wind speed, because that's going to influence when you can apply your pesticides. They look at humidity levels, because that's going to tell how quickly the hay might dry, whether or not it's appropriate to cut now, or whether you're going to want to wait for a more favorable window so that hay cures properly and is available to be put up at a regular time. If they're into animal production, they're looking at what are the humidity levels, because some of the biggest problems with animal stress can be not so much when the temperatures are extremely high, but when the humidities are combined with those high temperatures, animals suffer the same sort of heat stress that humans do. And there have been a number of cases where there have been huge animal losses because the humidity levels have been high and the animals hadn't been properly or hadn't been able to adapt to those conditions. So handling techniques can minimize the stress that those animals face, and knowing what conditions are going to be gives the producer a chance to implement those strategies.
You know, the crops need X amount of rain, and if you get too little, you know, then the crops aren't doing what they need to do. If you get too much, then you got standing water. And then when it comes to wheat, you've got the concern of rust and all these diseases that develop with it. So agriculture is so sensitive to such minor changes in the weather. And I think that's why we hear so much from farmers and ranchers that, well, you know, we could sure use a 1/4 of an inch of rain. Well, if we could order it up, man, we would probably be making big time dollars, but that's not the case.
Let's talk about the science of meteorology.
Yeah, the most visible part of meteorology, of course, is the guy you see on TV every night, and or the guy you hear on the radio every day. But a very, very small percentage of meteorologists actually work in the broadcast industry. By far, the largest employer of meteorologists is the government, either under the National Weather Service or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Service, which is part of the Department of Commerce, or under the Department of Defense in the military, especially in the Navy and the Air Force. They have most of the meteorologists. So a lot of people have that kind of misnomer that meteorologists are the guy you see on TV or radio, but that's just a very, very, very small portion of it. And a rapidly growing portion of meteorology is the private sector. There are private weather companies that provide very specific forecasts for very specific industries that the Weather Service cannot provide and that TV meteorologists don't have the time to provide. For example, an electric utility, it may matter a lot whether it's going to be a 9-mile-an-hour wind or an 11-mile-an-hour wind at their wind farm, and at what time of the day the wind shift is going to occur at a very specific point, whereas to the general public, there's no difference between a 9-mile-an-hour wind and an 11-mile-an-hour wind. And if you're within an hour or two of the wind shift, you know, that's good enough. But for certain industries, it's not good enough. And agriculture is increasingly becoming one of those industries. A lot of feed yards now have their own private meteorology services to determine the stress on the cattle days in advance so that they can plan with some of the shading, the cooling, the watering during summertime, and then the protection from extreme cold and blizzards in the wintertime.
When it comes to forecasting the weather, there are computer models that we're looking at. Basically a simulation for how the atmosphere should behave given these conditions. And those initial conditions are collected from weather balloons that go up 2 times a day. In Kansas, the balloon goes up in Dodge City and Topeka. Goes up at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock at night. The information that's collected from those balloons goes into the computer model, and that's the starting point for making a forecast.
In weather terms, a model is a mathematical and physical simulation of the atmosphere. So what we do is we feed as much information into it as we have. Surface conditions, satellite, radar, all those things. We feed them into a computer that has a very high computing capacity. And then using basic, actually advanced calculus and advanced physics, it is able to simulate, if you will, what the atmosphere is going to be a set period in the future. So you can make that clock on that computer run really fast, so in a few minutes you can find out what the weather may look like in 12 hours or 24 hours or 36 hours.
So these computer models, you know, they're specialized in figuring out what the weather's going to do in 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, and then we have another set of computer models that will take us out 16 days. And we like to say that anything beyond 10 days is getting kind of sketchy. You know, it may be more of a trend than anything else.
Well, an interesting thing about weather modeling and weather in general is that if you put the exact same information into 2 different computer models, you will get 2 different answers, even though you started with the same initial set of conditions. And that's where you might hear the meteorologists talk about, well, the European model is showing this, but the global forecast model is showing this, or the nested grid model, or whatever. You know, there's all different kinds of models, and it's gotten to the point with computing power now that even local TV stations and local universities run their own models. So you may have 20 different ideas of what the weather's going to be like in 24 hours, and that's where the human meteorologist comes in. It's kind of up to them to decide which one of these models, if any of them, because they can all be wrong, but which one of these models might be telling the truth or as close to the truth as possible about what the weather is going to be like.
You know, the weather is a big part of everyday life. You know, we all talk about it. It impacts us all in very different ways. And I think that's part of the excitement as a meteorologist is, you know, whether you're in agriculture, you might be a farmer, you might be a rancher, you might have a landscape business, you might just be driving to work, but weather impacts us all, and we're all talking about it now. We're all connected in very different ways. It used to be, you know, you would just watch the weather, 6 and 10 o'clock news, but now through social media outlets, we're all finding different forecasts.
Yeah, weather is changing a lot, and a lot of that has to do with the way it's distributed and the way it's received. When I started in TV, it was what we called schedule TV, where you really didn't know what the weather was going to be like tomorrow unless you sat down at 10:15 at night and watched the weather forecast. Just as you didn't know if the Royals won today unless you sat down and watched the sportscast at 10:25, even though the game was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because there was no such thing as the internet and cell phones and smartphones. Well, that obviously has changed drastically. Almost everyone, including almost every farmer I know, has that information at their fingertips. And they can, as they're planning their day to do some burning, some spraying, some field work, they can pull a phone out of their pocket, punch a few buttons, and know instantly what the wind's going to be like, when the wind shift is going to happen, at what time will the rain start. And as the forecasts get more and more accurate and the availability gets more and more, it has vastly changed how we deal with weather in the day-to-day operations of not only farming but everything in life. The accessibility to current weather information, it's hard for some people to imagine, but that is a very new phenomena. We did not have that ability even 20 years ago to get the kind of information that we have now, and it's only going to get better in the future.
What is the difference between climatology and meteorology?
Meteorology is generally looking at current weather conditions, predicting what might happen in the near future, and climatology is looking more at weather patterns and trends over long periods of time. So what's this year's pattern versus what it may have been a decade ago or 100 years ago?
There is, of course, our day-to-day changes in weather, and then there's what's climate, and that's weather over a very long period of time. So the two cannot be confused. And in this day and age, there's a lot of concerns of course, climate change and global warming, and we get one particular weather event, and people want to relate that to climate change, but what people forget is climate, you're talking over 50 or 100 years, whereas day-to-day changes in weather, that's a very different category.
As a climatologist, I get questions that cover the range. It's all sorts of things. Probably the most common, though, will be on the precipitation. How much did we receive? How does this compare to the long term? Who got what kind of questions? That's probably the most common. But again, I've had everything from, was there a blizzard in the 1850s in southwestern Kansas because one of my ancestors disappeared in that area during that time period, to what is the average humidity, because I've got a manufacturing plant that I want to calculate what the energy requirements will be to moderate the conditions in my plant to what's necessary for production. So it'll go the whole range.
How does the weather affect crops?
When you're talking about compensating for poor weather, it becomes rather difficult to manage. One of the things is that there's only so much you can do. You don't really know necessarily what's going to be coming. You've got forecasts, but those are of limited reliability. So some of the things that producers will do will be look at which varieties they plant so that it has a wider range of tolerance so that it can handle both a dry condition and a more favorable moisture pattern.
Yeah, I think that that's just becoming something that we're having to do because drought has become a significant topic in recent years. And how can you operate, with less moisture? And I think we're seeing a lot of people think along those lines that in years where drought is a big part of the plains, Kansas, having a variety of crop that is, can adapt to those sort of conditions is the direction that I think we're seeing a lot of people go. We hear now people talking about planting, maybe moving away from wheat and they're planting a different kind of crop that can tolerate hot, dry weather because that's something that we're seeing a lot of here in the plains. It started 4 or 5 years ago here in Kansas, and although we've had some rainfall and we've had some attempts to get out of drought, we really haven't squashed it as much as some of us would like to see. So I think we're seeing a lot of scientists kind of think more along drier conditions, what can we do to have crops that can adapt to those sort of events, because we're not having those big rains like we used to have here in the plains.
When you talk about varieties and crops, you can compare it to a variety in a flower. You may have a petunia, and you've got a red petunia, you've got a pink petunia, you've got a smaller flowering petunia, you have the cascading ones that tend to send out more runners. Corn or soybeans or sorghum also will have varietal differences where one particular variety may have more resistance to a particular pest. They may have a longer or shorter growing season. They may have a bigger yield potential. So all of those factors go into the decision of what exactly will be planted on a particular field.
Certain crops require more water than others. Certain crops are more drought resistant than others. And here in the Central Plains, of course, we're famously known for our hard red winter wheat, which is a very drought resistant type crop. But we're getting a lot more diversified, a lot more corn and a lot more soybeans, a lot more canola and crops like that do require a little more water. So the planning during a drought varies based on that. And then, of course, whether you use the standard tilling methods or no-till methods affect the amount of moisture in the soil as well.
They may change their planting strategies, so they may plant a little bit earlier or a little bit later so that when the crop is in its most vulnerable state, it will be in the most favorable weather pattern at that time.
How does the weather affect animals?
And livestock is a broad term. When you're talking livestock, you're talking anything from hogs to cattle to chickens to any commodity that is moved and produced. And each one of those has a subsection. There may be a cattle producer that runs purely on pasture and has to adjust the number of cattle for the pasture conditions, while there are, of course, giant feedlots where we finish cattle. And when you pack that many animals into a small area, things like heat can vastly affect. So, a lot of the feed yards play around with different ways to keep the cattle cool.
Yeah, heat and humidity is a real important part, of course, in the summertime, because the more humidity that you have in the atmosphere, the harder it is for humans and animals to cool down. And that cooling process for humans happens through evaporating sweat from our skin. So we sweat when we get hot, and when you evaporate the sweat from your body, that's what helps cool humans down. But hogs, they can't sweat. So when you get hot temperatures and high humidity, some of them go into panting, and that's why a lot of hogs like to lay in a cold, wet mud hole, because that's what helps cool them down. So you'll see a lot of guys operating at the coolest hours of the day, which typically happens anywhere from about 3 a.m. in the morning up until about 7 o'clock, and then in the summertime after that, the temperature really starts to rise. And in a hot stretch of weather, you can easily be 90 to 100 degrees by 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. So you'll see a lot of hog farmers do a lot of their work early in the day when the temperatures are cooler, because hogs can't sweat, and you don't want them getting overheated, or like everything else, something that overheats is either going to get ill or potentially die.
Right, and then winter, as you go to the other end of the spectrum, really affects the livestock as well. A lot of cattle are also moved during the winter time, so there can be situations where you've got half a dozen semis scheduled to come and pick up cattle and move them to a feed yard, and that morning you wake up and you've got 13 inches of snow on the ground. So you've got to arrange for a bulldozer to come in and get some of that snow out of the way so the trucks can get into the corrals and get the cattle loaded, and then of course the feed needs. Once their natural feed is covered up by ice or snow, the only way they're going to eat is by you giving them feed. So the feeding process is a large portion of what livestock producers spend their time on in the wintertime, from grinding hay to mixing it to coming up with different ratios that work for different kinds of weather, and then of course the very laborious job of distributing that to a large number of livestock.
A single storm, strong wind, or flood is called a weather event, and they can have a huge impact.
Weather events, impact us all a little bit differently. For example, 6 inches of snow for a guy that lives in town, that means he's got to shovel his driveway, and it might be a real pain. But 6 inches of snow for the farmer and rancher, when it lands nice and evenly on a wheat crop, is excellent news, because not only is it moisture, but it also acts as an insulator and protects the wheat crop from bitterly cold temperatures. So most farmers will tell you that some snow in the wintertime, they're okay with that. They'd like it to lay nice and even and not end up in the ditch with a strong north wind. But snow in the wintertime is good news for the winter wheat crop, although it may be a complete headache for those driving and those that live in town.
It's very readily apparent to the producers that individual weather events can have major impacts on production. And that can be everything from a flash flood that washes out your field, or a hailstorm that takes what had been a record production of wheat and basically zeroes it out.
And hail, I don't think, is good for anybody unless you're in the auto repair industry, or you've got insurance and that sort of thing. But hail's very destructive no matter how you look at it, whether it's for a wheat crop, on a rooftop, on your car, whatever it may be. Hail's very destructive across the board.
A lot of people, especially that live in the city, don't realize how impactful a single weather event can be on a farmer's income. Unlike a job where you work in a factory where you get paid every 2 weeks, 26 weeks out of the year, a lot of farmers get 1, 2, or 3 paychecks a year. It may be when they sell their wheat crop, when they sell their corn crop, and when they sell their cattle, for example, just to give a simple example. Well, if you are 2 days before harvesting that wheat crop and you have one single hailstorm go across that field, your income instantly went from a good year to 0. And there are things like insurance and disaster relief for some of that, but it's usually only enough to keep the farmer from going out of business until the next year, to get the next year's crop in. And what a lot of city people don't realize is that when that farmer gets affected by that one weather event, the city also gets affected by that one weather event, because the farmer, if he has a good year, he's going to come to town and buy a new pickup. He's going to come to town and buy parts for his equipment. He's going to come to town and buy groceries. And if he's got a bad year, he's going to drive the old pickup from a couple of years ago. He's going to buy the cheaper food in the store. He's going to maybe not buy his kids new boots this year, but wait until next year, So it has a ripple effect. Agriculture is the biggest industry in the central United States, and quite honestly in the most of the United States. Agriculture affects not only the farms, but it affects the cities, the towns. It affects everyone in one way or another. And I think that's something that city dwellers lose sight of. That when you hear a weather warning on a spring afternoon when they interrupt your favorite program and say, baseball-sized hail and 70-mile-an-hour winds are hitting this rural area out in the middle of nowhere, and the people get mad. Well, why are you even telling me about this? To someone, that's their livelihood. That is their paycheck getting wiped out completely. And so I would just say that for city dwellers, have a little patience, have a little kindness for your fellow neighbors. They're the ones that feed you. The guys in the country are the ones that feed you. So remember that they are suffering when things like that happen.
That wraps up this episode of Real Ag. Remember, you can see every episode of this series by going to SmokyHillsTV.org. Until next time, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
Servitech has been helping producers across the Midwest make the planet more productive since 1975. We are proud sponsors of Real Ag, helping tell the story of how your food makes it to your plate.
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.